This talk was recorded at One Mind Dharma in Petaluma, California, and is offered freely for your enjoyment. This is from our new class, Deep Dharma, in which we dive into some of the Buddhist teachings. You can learn more about us at www.oneminddharma.com, where you can find our schedule, other podcasts, and ways to support us. So we're going to start by talking about the First Noble Truth. This is often taught to be one of the Buddha's core, very foundational teachings. Tradition holds that it was the first teaching that the Buddha gave after his awakening. He didn't want to teach, and then he was kind of convinced to teach and share his path. And the first teaching he gave was on the Four Noble Truths. It's called the First Discourse. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's a few pages long, and I don't want to put you to sleep. But I am going to read a little bit of it just because I think it's important. It's considered like the first discourse that the Buddha gave. There's a reason that, it's kind of held like that in legend. It's important stuff. If you haven't heard the suttas before, I will warn you right now that it can be awfully repetitive. So I'm going to read it as is, and I apologize in advance for that. I actually really like the Bhikkhu Bodhi translations. He'll use like the ellipses, like the ... to say like it's just repeating itself here. Yeah. Thus I have heard, on one occasion, the Blessed One, the Buddha, was dwelling at Varanasi in the deer park at Isipatana. There the Blessed One addressed the monks of groups of 5 thus. He had 5 followers initially. Monks, these 2 extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forth into homelessness, because they were all living as nomads or ascetics. What 2? The pursuit of sensual happiness and sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble, unbeneficial, and the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, unbeneficial. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Buddha has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, and leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. So he's talking, the Buddha's pointing towards this middle path of not starving ourselves to find awakening, as that was a teaching back then, was if we starve the body, then we can get to the soul. So that was why people did the starving, and the legend holds that the Buddha ate a grain of rice a day for many years. I can't comment on the validity of that, but that is the legend. And then he goes on, and what monks is that middle way awakened to by the Buddha? It is the Noble Eightfold Path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This is the middle way awakened to by the Buddha, which gives rise to vision, gives rise to knowledge, leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. You can hear some repetition there. So then here he goes into the Four Noble Truths, and this is the part I really wanted to share about. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering. Aging is suffering. Illness is suffering. Death is suffering. Union with what is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. And he goes on to talk about the second noble truth, the third noble truth, the fourth noble truth, and on and on and on. So just to point that it's one of the first things in that legend has that the Buddha talked about when he got awakened. I will mention, just for accuracy's sake, that this wasn't actually the first teaching the Buddha gave. Most scholars agree that where the teaching was given and who it was given to and the wording of it was actually a teaching that came years later. But that's how legend holds it, just as it's one of the most, it happens, and it happens a lot. It's just due to the oral nature of these teachings and how they were passed down for years by people remembering them. And they were often remembered and recited in order. Bless you. So anyway, so that's just where he kind of introduces this idea of the First Noble Truth. And the First Noble Truth is simply that there is suffering in life, or there is dukkha. And I probably shouldn't have even used the word suffering because I don't love that translation of dukkha. Sometimes this truth can be taken to be. I've given talks on dukkha and on suffering, and people have been said, wow, Buddhism's so depressing or cynical. And I don't think my experience of it is not that it's cynical or depressing, but realistic. And I know that's what like a cynic would say. But it's not saying that everything is suffering and we're bound to be unhappy and really suffer all the time. It's rather pointing towards this lack of satisfaction we have in life. The word dukkha itself means bad axle hole, is the etymology of the word. And yeah, and I'll explain it in a moment. I know, I gotta be really careful when I say that because it can sound bad. But it comes from the Pali word ka means axle hole and du means bad. Its opposite is sukha, which is joy or not suffering. So one of the exactly. So the reason, although I don't know exactly why it comes from the word for bad axle hole, one of the common kind of metaphors used to describe it, and I think I've shared this before, is that if you're riding on an ox cart, which we don't do very much in the United States these days, and the axle hole is just slightly off, like not totally messed up, but just slightly not round, as it's rolling along, there might be a slight bump every time the wheel goes around. And at first, you might not even notice it. It might even be a little bit pleasant, like a little like change in the ride. But if you keep riding that bad axle hole for however many years old you are, it can become rather aggravating. Eventually our backs hurt. Maybe we're frustrated or annoyed with it. And that's kind of the image I like to use, that often when something like that's happening, this dukkha is subtle. It's not this suffering that we think it is. The common translations for the word dukkha, suffering is the most common. You've probably heard that before. Unsatisfactoriness, dis-ease, discontentment. And the teaching here is not that dukkha is necessarily a feeling or an emotion. Often we get confused that suffering is an emotion we're experiencing. But rather the teaching here is that things are inherently not leading to satisfaction for us. The specific teaching in the Dhammapada in the 20th chapter says, all conditioned things are dukkha. And what it means by conditioned things are things that are subject to causes and conditions. So everything we see, everything we feel, taste, smell, anything that happens at any of the sense doors, other than things that are not subject to conditioning, are things like the Four Noble Truths, nirvana, traditionally. So traditionally, there are three types of dukkha that we experience. The first one is really simple. I love the name. It's called dukkha dukkhata, which means pain, like dukkha. It's just, yeah, the common English translation is ordinary pain, which I always thought was a little bit like silly or funny, but it's true. We're subject to experiencing pain, right? Like in the body, there's that traditional teaching that birth is suffering because it brings us into a world of unsatisfactoriness. Death is, of course, many of us have stressful relationships with death, and for ourselves and for others. Aging, getting sick, they're all subject to pain. And I think one of the interesting things here is it's not just physical pain. We, of course, no matter how hard we try, we cannot avoid physical pain. But there are also things that we can't avoid, I think, in our psychosomatic system, in our nervous system. Like just talking about the hurricane and having lived in Florida, that reaction comes up without really any room for you not, you having room to jump in there necessarily. Fight or flight kicks in. Yeah, it's just totally natural. A really good example is I was meditating the other day with my phone on loud, which I do quite often. And I was like really waiting for a text from a potential client I was waiting for a contract to come back is what's happening. And my phone, I closed my eyes. We were meditating maybe like 15, 20 minutes in, and the phone buzzed, and I found my mind start running. And then a few minutes went by and I had settled. And the next time that the phone buzzed, I noticed that I could feel it in my nervous system just immediately. It wasn't like even a thought came up of like, oh, I wonder what it is, but it's the sound of the phone just happened, so just instantly. It intertwined in a way. So that's dukkha dukkhata, ordinary dukkha. The second kind is sankhara dukkhata, which is conditioned suffering or conditioned stress or dis-ease. There are many ways this is described. I personally think that it's one of the teachings around the First Noble Truth that gets way overcomplicated because people want to discuss what conditioned means and all this. But I think in its most simplest form, this is that second arrow that I've talked about before. When something happens, whether it's a pain or an experience or even something joyful, is like getting hit with a first arrow, and we respond by taking a second arrow and stabbing it in. So it's that second arrow. The example I often use is when we're sitting in meditation, my knees often hurt when I sit kind of Burmese style like this. And what often happens is I notice that my knee hurts, I stick with it for a few moments, I tune into the experience and see if there's any movement, really getting to know this first type of suffering. And then eventually what often happens is I begin thinking like the last time I stretched was like last century. Don't ever stretch. Of course I feel like this. And that's that kind of thought process that happens is this way in which we suffer around conditioning. One of my favorite words to describe it is fabrication. And it's not to say that if we're struggling with anxiety or worry or anger, that it's fabricated and therefore not real and therefore, your feelings don't matter or anything. I think that we can have experiences that are painful and cause us suffering, and we should tend to with compassion, and they're completely not based on reality, always. So just because I use the word fabricated, I don't want it to come off like it doesn't matter, or it's just you causing your own suffering, so get over it, or anything like that. Rather, I think we can see the ways in which we compound our suffering, and that could probably be a whole nother topic.
Don't fall down until you're shot.
Yeah. There you go. I love that. Yeah.
It's like my mantra sometimes. Don't fall down until you're
Don't
shot.
fall down until you're shot.
You start.
Yeah.
Yeah. And nothing's happened yet, but you're already like. Yeah. And it's always, well, not always. So often you've made it so much worse than it ever in reality could have ever.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that my whole life from my parents, from loved ones, from supportive, mentors and teachers that like, it often isn't as bad as we think it's going to be. And it's so true. Yet we continue to fall into that trap. I mean, it's a tough one. One of my, as I have a teacher and then I have some students I work with, and I often tell the story of I work in online marketing and I have monthly contracts with my clients that go month to month, and we have relatively few clients and relatively big contracts as far as if I lost one, it would affect me financially. Every time at the end of the month that I send in the invoice and the report of the work done, I'm like, who am I gonna lose? Who's gonna say thank you very much? That was a great month, and we're done. And the funny part is I've had this company for about 2 years now, and we haven't yet lost a client. We have a 100% client retention rate. But every month, without fail, when I send them out, I'm like, I don't want to look at my email. I'm scared. So it's the falling. I love that. Don't fall down before you're shot. The last kind of suffering traditionally is the suffering of impermanence or change, viparinama dukkhata. And this is one that I think can be really subtle and pervasive. One of my favorite stories about this is Thich Nhat Hanh's story of sitting outside and looking at the dew on the grass in the morning. and seeing how beautiful it is, and it was kind of like giving off a little shine or glimmer. And then as the sun came up and the heat rose, of course the dew evaporates, and Thich Nhat Hanh found himself rather sad, missing it. And that's this suffering of impermanence or change. We'll talk more about that when we move into the second noble truth, and which is the cause of our suffering. But really, we can see the ways in which we suffer around things that are impermanent and change. The truth is that everything's impermanent. Everything is in a state of flux and changing. So when we kind of cling to things as they are, we can suffer greatly. I see it often, even in things like my relationship with Elizabeth. We have a great relationship. I love her very much. She loves me very much. It's very supportive, but it's not the same as it used to be. When I met her, I just sold a company. I was 21 years old. She was 19, and it was summertime. And I just sold a company, and she worked at a clothing store, and we spent like all day, every day at the beach and hanging out and going to like amusement parks, and it was like carefree. And now it's not that way. So there are ways that like I suffer around that, even though the present conditions are really pleasant. I think that this suffering around impermanence and change is like a subtle one often. We often don't notice that it's causing dis-ease. When we're leaning towards something or kind of holding on to how something is, it can be less suffering and more kind of a lack of satisfaction.
But as you age, that changes.
Yeah. Well, and that's a great example of course, the body, and then the mind. I've seen it in some of my loved ones. Both the body go, the mind really go. I mean, my grandma had Alzheimer's, and that was a whole other thing. But even I have two grandparents who are relatively healthy. They're about to be 90, but you can see the change happening, and it can be very uncomfortable. And it can be, and part of the problem with these, or part of the ways in which we struggle, is we can suffer over that impermanence, that change, and then we can kind of fall into that second category of pain where we're compounding it. Or maybe there's the first one present as well, where there's physical pain caused by the change, and they can kind of dance around with each other and just snowball into this, so many different things, whether it's a panic attack or lashing out at someone or shutting down with depression. So those are the three, just to go over those again, the three types of dukkha that we experience. Ordinary pain, which perhaps we can find a better word for that. The conditioning pain or the fabricated pain, that second arrow, the way that we make pain for ourselves. And then the pain of impermanence or change. And I think I appreciate that example of growing old, and that is traditionally one of the examples given, that aging is suffering, or aging is dukkha, illness is dukkha, death is dukkha.
It's less subtle, like you were saying, how it can be subtle, but then there's a point in your life, in some respects, where a lot of it's not as subtle anymore. It's a lot more obvious, and it's a different approach to it. I often say, for me, like I reached this point in my life where you feel like you're still sort of holding on to back here, which could be anywhere from 35 to 40s or whatever. You know what I mean? Like you're still in your brain, you're still kind of there, and you think of your body kind of like, oh, I could still do those things. And sort of this resistance, and it's this place where it's getting harder and harder because you're getting pulled further and further in this direction. It's harder and harder to hold on, and then at one point you just got to say, I got to just let go, because that is always going to be just that much further behind me. It's a really interesting mental thing, because you live a good portion of your life, up to that point at least, where it's not as noticeable from year to year, and then all of a sudden you reach a place where it's suddenly it is a lot more.
It's not subtle anymore.
It's not subtle anymore, but you're still kind of holding on there. And the only way to find a little more peace is to say, okay, I gotta learn to live here rather than identify with that, because that isn't here anymore. And
it can be in my experience in working with people, that period can be an intense period of discovering our identity again in a weird way. Mm-hmm. And I haven't gone through that period myself as far as age goes, so I don't want to pretend that I fully understand, but I do work with a lot of people, and I see it as like a period often of self-discovery, as we have a fixed view about who we are and a fear of who we're becoming, which causes us to lose sight of who we actually are in this moment.
Because there is a pretty good period, a chunk of time, and you guys are kind of in it, where it doesn't seem like it changes all that much. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
There's a good 15, 20-year period where you're, okay, things are good. But then all of a sudden you just do one of those walk past the mirror things or something, and you're like looking at your mother, or you see something looking back in a glance, and you're like, here's that person. It's really changed, and it's trippy to be in that place in life where you're like, I gotta let go of that. I'm still that person, because that person is in here too, but I gotta not cling.
Yeah.
And I have to be able to be okay and have a new identity as the person I am now, because that's who I have. It's
a trip.
It's a weird.
I imagine.
It's a weird place to be, and you kind of. It's like one of those things where you think about your parents or people and you're like, okay, I get it now.
Yeah.
You never get it when you're in your 20s.
I was just saying that about something else before we started meditating. That when I was even younger, I didn't get at all why my parents did this, and now that I'm even in my 20s, I'm like, oh, that makes sense to me.
Right.
And it just continues to happen. I always joke that the longer I pay attention, the more I realize my parents were right. It's like, it's pretty crazy.
And they're like...
Yeah, and they're like, ha, told you so. There's this piece of... there's a part in one of Noah Vine's books, I think it's in The Heart of Revolution, where he talks about on a physical level, like just a purely scientific physical level, almost all the cells in your body have regenerated since you were a little kid, right? Except for, as far as we know, some neurons in the brain actually can live as long as we live. But it just points towards this interesting thing that like almost your entire body is not actually the same physical body, because the cells have died and regenerated. And it's very interesting how we kind of cling to this solid sense of self, which can be healthy to build a sense of identity and to know our habits and our tendencies and what we need to work on and what our likes and dislikes are. But also we can notice that we can allow some space for fluidity. And I think often, I think a lot of people suffer around that. Age is a really good example. I had a similar experience with drug addiction, where it really was this kind of, you walk past the mirror and it's like, oh my God, like I'm that kid that when I started smoking pot in middle school, I thought I'll never be like that. And that's who I am. And it was this kind of aha moment of just, a really kind of clear seeing the impermanence and seeing the change. So that's a really good example of a not so subtle way in which we suffer. Any physical pain, I think, is a pretty good example of often not subtle ways in which we experience dukkha. I think sometimes as was mentioned, the kind of like response of the nervous system to something, not even like a thought necessarily, but sometimes, especially people that have some sort of history of trauma, may hear a loud noise and their nervous system gets a little jolt, and there's not even a thought there of like, I'm in danger. It's not that conscious, but so that can be dukkha sometimes in a really obvious way, and sometimes we have that jolt and don't notice that that's a moment of dukkha. And then there's, of course, kind of the mental states, which are really can be dukkha. Anxiety is a common one. Fear is a really common one. And fear serves us in certain ways. Not to keep talking about people pointing guns at us or anything, but if someone's pointing a gun at you, fear is probably, in my opinion, a relatively appropriate response. Anger is a way in which we create dukkha. I think one of the worst ways in which I create dukkha is what I call justified anger. And I put justified in air quotes because it's not. But where I think someone wronged me in some way, and I'm like, no, they deserve to have me angry at them, really creates this just kind of unpleasant experience for myself of not wanting to feel how I feel. And then holding on to something, which actually was my last one on this list, that really holding on to something, and it can be something like an identity, a physical body, it could be a relationship, it could be an item. I'm going to read, I highly recommend, this book's free, you can go online and get it, and I can give you the link, but it's Ajahn Chah is a Thai forest meditation teacher, and he's kind of a smart ass, for lack of a better term, and I mean no disrespect by that. He's a wonderful teacher, but he can be rather blunt. But he has a passage in here I liked. Suppose we came to possess a very expensive object. The minute that thing comes into our possession, our mind changes. Where can I keep it? If I leave it there, somebody might steal it. We worry ourselves into a state, trying to find a place to keep the object. And when did the mind change? It changed the minute we obtained the object. Suffering arose right then. No matter where we leave the object, we can't relax, so we're left with trouble. Whether sitting, walking, or lying down, we are lost in worry. This is suffering. And when did it arise? As soon as we understood that we had obtained something. That's where the suffering lies. Before we had the object, there was no suffering. It hadn't yet arisen because there wasn't yet an object for us to cling to. So I don't think that Ajahn Chah is saying that things are inherently bad necessarily, but that things are inherently have a state of dukkha in them. Everything's impermanent.
Do you ever hear the George Carlin thing about stuff?
Yeah. It's
kind of made me think of that.
We had a Dharma teacher at Against the Stream bring that in and play it one time, which was pretty funny because there were people new to the group and they were like, what is this? But it is, it's like we want all this stuff, and it's not, I think that we can strike a balance with it a little bit, that, we're not just talking about total materialism is bad or it causes suffering, but often like it happens with me, even like spiritual materialism or spiritual craving. When I get a new book and I just I go like this to it, and hold it and want to read it all the time and don't want to put it down, that we can really kind of see that there's some lack of satisfaction that arises in that moment. One of my favorite kind of thoughts about this first noble truth is that when we see it, when we see how much there's this unsatisfactoriness in life, it can be a little bit like running into a brick wall sensation. And often what people do is they kind of just turn back towards dukkha because it's comfortable. I liken it to the very famous allegory of the cave where there's a person chained up. It's the only life they ever know. They see their shadows. And when they get out into the real world and out into the sunlight, which is objectively more pleasant, maybe a little more freedom, a little more ease, it's too much for the person and they go back to their life that they know. And that can happen to us sometimes, where I know it happens with me, where I have seen it very clearly on retreat where I'm having a difficult moment and I'm really trying to practice compassion. And then at one point I just go, screw it, I'm just going to beat myself up over it. And it's like a conscious thought. And it doesn't usually last long, but it can be just because it's easier to fall back into that rut that we've built in our minds and hearts of dukkha and not respond differently. So understanding that there's all this unsatisfactoriness in life and in experience, the kind of last thing I wanted to share is using this truth as a practice. We translate this teaching as the Four Noble Truths. Many scholars actually point out that noble in that sense is used as an adjective, and the true sense of the term in Pali is a verb, the four unnobling truths. That is, these four truths that if we work with, we become noble. So there's three practices with the first noble truth that the Buddha offered. And I'm going to read from this book. It's called Dancing with Life. It's just an investigation of the Four Noble Truths. It's a really good book. I will say that the author, as much as I've sat with him and love him, has had some bad press recently. So I don't endorse poor behavior on his part, but it is a really good book nonetheless.
Who's the author?
Philip Moffitt. He teaches at Spirit Rock sometimes. I've sat a retreat with him. He's a great teacher, but he had some ethical issues, it sounded like. Allegations of ethical issues, I should say. So I'm just going to read a section here where he describes it pretty clearly. Understanding the first noble truth involves the practice and realization of three specific insights about dukkha. First, realizing that the philosophical description that life seems to elicit feelings of dukkha at every turn is correct. So first, realizing the philosophical description, so what we're sitting here talking about, that life seems to elicit feelings of dukkha, and I would disagree with that terminology a little bit, but elicits dukkha at every turn is correct. So this is often referred to as the reflective period, that we reflect on it and kind of see in and out of meditation how life is filled with this kind of lack of satisfaction. Secondly, we gain insight into our suffering by penetrating it with conscious awareness day by day, moment by moment, which is often called the investigation period. So, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but really when a moment of suffering comes up, not pushing away from it and just not liking it and trying to get rid of it, but investigating it and looking at it and continuing to bring awareness to it. And finally, deeply accepting this truth as part of your life and that it affects how your mind reacts to all your experience. And this is called knowing. It's often translated as knowing, and we think of knowing as like intellectually knowing things. But what this is pointing towards is like knowing, like there's a teacher, Brian Lesage, who says there's a difference between knowing something in your brain and knowing it in your bones. Like really knowing it, having an intuitive sense of this truth. The Ajahn Chah again says, there's difficulty in practice, but in anything we undertake, we have to pass through difficulty to reach ease. In Dhamma practice, we begin with the truth of dukkha, this pervasive unsatisfactoriness of existence. As soon as we experience it, we may lose heart. We don't want to look at it. Dukkha is really the truth, but we want to get around it somehow. It's similar to the way we don't like to look at old people and prefer to look at those who are young. If we don't want to look at dukkha, we will never understand dukkha, no matter how many births we go through. Dukkha is a noble truth. If we allow ourselves to face it, we will start to seek a way out of it. He goes on to say, my way of training people involves some suffering, because suffering is the Buddha's path to enlightenment. He wanted us to see suffering and to see origination, cessation, and the path, which are the next steps on the Four Noble Truths. And this points towards how important suffering is really in relieving our suffering, relieving our pain, and bringing us some sense of ease. Ajahn Chah is often saying over and over again in his teachings that without suffering, we'd have no potential for liberation. And it's kind of an interesting way to look at it, but it's true that it's the suffering that really allows us to spring forth with these qualities of understanding and seeing. So working with this first noble truth, just to kind of wrap up, there's three things that we need to, that the instruction is to do, to ponder it or reflect on it, to investigate it in our own experience, and to know it. And we can't force ourselves to know it, but we find when we meditate more and more, when we bring awareness to our daily lives more and more, that we can really just see it arise. We can see its presence in the little things. We can see it in the more subtle things and not just the big moments. I think that this is one of the first teachings of the Buddha traditionally, is that life is full of unsatisfactoriness, is to me a direct call for some compassion practice, which is why we sat with that kind of metta compassion practice earlier. Is it's like really a call. If life is full of suffering and dis-ease, then although compassion isn't like the first and a half noble truth by any means, to me it is. We have to have compassion in order to turn towards the suffering and be with it. Often we have a tendency to see the first noble truth as a stepping stone to the other ones. Like, okay, that's the first one. The second one's there's a cause to our suffering. The third one is that cessation of our suffering is possible. And the fourth one is like the prescription, the Noble Eightfold Path. And we just want to get to that. But it's important to use it as a standalone practice to really understand. In the suttas over and over again, it's stressed to know our suffering, that we have to cultivate the ability to know our suffering. Jack Cornfield, who's a student of Ajahn Chah's, says, spiritual life's not about avoiding loss and blame and difficulty, but taking those difficulties that come to us and using them to awaken a wise and free and compassionate heart no matter what. The very last thing I'll offer is that the First Noble Truth is often used as a form of spiritual bypass. The Buddha did not address this directly, but this is the process by which we kind of stop ourselves from experiencing something by using some spiritual principle. Common examples of spiritual bypass are like, yeah, I'm hungry, but there's starving kids in Africa, so is it really that bad? Yes, there are starving kids in Africa. There's probably hungry kids in our own town right here. And it's not to take away from that, but often what we're doing is denying our own experience by kind of bypassing it with something bigger. I've heard it myself from students. I've heard it from people that send us questions online or ask us questions about our podcast. Something bad happens and they go, oh, well, life is full of suffering. And although that's true, we have to be careful not to just use it as an excuse. It's a framework for understanding. This point towards knowing isn't just like, oh, suffering, dukkha, like good, done with it, don't need to investigate it. That it's a continual kind of cycle of reflecting, investigating, and knowing over and over again. We can't just place it in some experience into the box of this is dukkha, and now I don't need to look at it or know the suffering because I already know it because I've looked at it before. We need to continue looking at it. Thank you for listening to this recorded talk from One Mind Dharma. Please visit www.oneminddharma.com to learn more about us, make a donation in support of this podcast, join us in person, or subscribe to our daily guided meditation emails.